Yes. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk at this 70th meeting of IREPAS. I have been asked to talk about the state of the world, which is something I, continuously have to evaluate. As it was mentioned a few seconds ago, I'm the Chief Economic Advisor of the World Economic Forum, and in that forum we continuously monitor all the countries in the world. We monitor their competitiveness, we monitor their performance, and of course in September we publish the Global Competitiveness Report with a ranking of 148 countries in the world. So let me take the opportunity to discuss the state of the world, and I will do that in three stages. First, let me talk about the global outlook, okay, the world as a whole. Then I will focus on developed markets, and finally I will talk about developing or emerging markets. Okay. Now this is okay. Let me start with the global outlook. The last 12 months, the last year has been disappointing at the global scale, in the global arena. The growth has been about 2.9%, and after a recession that essentially decoupled the emerging markets from the developed markets. We were all hyped up with BRICS for a while. Now, on top of the disappointment in the aggregate, now there has been various kinds of decoupling. Okay, we can no longer say the emerging world is doing well and the developed world is not doing well. Now there are developed countries that are doing and will continue to do well. United States, Britain, for example. Some will do not so good, Europe and Japan. Within Europe, there can continue to be some countries that do fairly well, some countries that do, for example, UK, Germany, and France, and some countries that will continue to be weak, like Spain, and some countries that will actually be in deep trouble, like Italy. Now, in the emerging world, we also observe decoupling. In the emerging world, we see that the much hyped BRIC countries or BRICS countries almost collapsing. Some of them having really terrible performance. Brazil, South Africa, Russia. Some of them not collapsing, maybe. I will talk about this a bit later, not collapsing yet, but the growth performance is not as stellar as it used to be. That includes India and China. And we observe the emergence of a whole array of smaller, well-managed, open countries that are doing and will continue to do well. Countries in Asia include Korea, Malaysia, countries in Latin America include Chile, Peru, Colombia, Mexico, in spite of the commodity price correction. Countries in sub-Saharan Africa include Angola, Kenya, Nigeria, and Mozambique. So overall, we see that there's going to be a lot of smaller, well-managed developing countries or emerging countries that are going to be doing well. And we, at the same time, we observe what is now called the fragile five countries, countries with that are not doing well and will not do well in the near future. That includes Indonesia, Brazil, Turkey, South Africa, India, to which I will include another 6. So I will talk about the not the Ocean 11, but the Fragile 11. That would include Ukraine, Russia, Thailand, Hungary, Venezuela, and Argentina. Okay, so that's the state of the world as of today, and as it looks like at the beginning of 2014. Now. So let me start the discussion in the developed markets. Okay, here first I will discuss the overall picture and then focus on the 3 largest developed zones: United States, Europe, and Japan. Now the prospects for the developed world is that will improve, but it will improve only slightly. Okay, so let me discuss these 2 parts separately. It will improve. Why do I think that the developed world will improve? Well, first, after 4 years of deleveraging, families, firms, finance corporations have been reducing their debts. Now they are in a position to spend a little bit more. Okay. And therefore, we should expect in the developed world a stronger private demand. Okay. Second, the fiscal drag, the reduction in government spending or increase in taxes is going to be smaller than it was in 2013, maybe with the exception of Japan, which, as you know, is about to implement the consumption tax with uncertain implications. Third, the tail risks of the past have not materialized, and they're gone. Remember, a year ago, you had been here a year ago, I would probably have been talking about the collapse of the Eurozone, Greece exiting the Euro, maybe the collapse of Spain and Italy. I would have been talking about the fiscal cliff in the United States, the government, the closing of the government as Republicans and Democrats did not agree on how to solve the fiscal problems. I would have been talking about Iran and the nuclear threats and the possibility of Israel invading, which was a threat about a year ago. And I would have been talking about the hard landing of China. Okay, these were 4 big threats just a year ago. None of them has materialized, and 3 of them are completely gone. Nobody thinks that the euro will break now. Nobody thinks that there's going to be a fiscal cliff. In fact, the fiscal problems have been postponed for at least 2 years in the United States. Nobody, the Iran nuclear problem has been partly solved. The Chinese question remains. I will come back to China in a few seconds, or in a few minutes. And finally, the 4th reason for thinking that the developed world will improve is that the lower than expected inflation, despite the massive printing of money over the last few years, inflation has not exploded. And this means that monetary expansion can continue, or at least will not be reduced fast, which would be problematic for the developed world. Okay. Now we will continue to see the United States reducing the money supply, reducing the increase in the money supply, so-called tapering. The increase in interest rate, I think it's far in the future. It will happen, but not in 2014, probably 2015. So the monetary expansion, even though it will end at some point in the near future, it will not end immediately. Okay, and therefore that should be a reason for cautious optimism within the developed markets. Now, I said the developed markets will be growing, but will be growing slightly. Now, why only slightly? Right? There are 4 reasons to be optimistic. However, why do I think the growth will not be very strong overall? Okay. First, even though I said that the deleveraging has occurred in many countries, it has not occurred everywhere. Okay. The public sector still need to reduce debt in key countries, the Eurozone, the United Kingdom, Japan. Banks still have to deleverage, have to reduce their debt in places like the Eurozone. Households need to continue to deleverage in the periphery of Europe. Therefore, some areas, in some key areas of the developed world, there will be weak demand because people will have to continue to reduce their debts. Second, as I said, monetary expansion will not end soon, but it's starting to come to an end. Right, tapering in the United States is already taking place, and therefore the money happiness will not stop, but it will not be as expansionary as it has been in the near past. The structural reforms that need to take place in key countries have been very slowly implemented, if at all. Okay, the structural reforms in the European periphery have not taken place at all. The third arrow of, third leg of Abenomics in Japan has not been implemented. Only the first 2 have been implemented. The United States have not, are slowly to implement entitlement tax reforms and so on. So the structural reforms will have to take place sometime soon, and that will represent, if they don't, even are not implemented soon, that will represent problems. And then there is a phenomenon that was pointed out by Larry Summers, who was the Secretary of the Treasury for Bill Clinton. He talked about secular stagnation. He says that it is really incomprehensible that after all this massive monetary expansion over the last few years, growth has been so anemic in the developed world. And he asks, isn't it possible that we entered a new era of low long-term growth? Is it possible that we enter an era what he called secular stagnation? Are we entering an era of Japanification of the entire world? Is 1% the new norm? Okay. I don't know whether this is true, but this is now, in the air. He made a very important speech 3 months ago at the IMF, and now everybody is concerned that he might be right. Why have we not grown faster given the massive expansion in monetary and fiscal policy over the last few years? It remains to be seen whether this is true, but we have to keep an eye on secular stagnation. Now, let me go into a little bit more detail in the United States. The United States is, I think, along with the United Kingdom, the superstar of the developed world. Okay, growth in the last quarter has been 2.4%. It is expected to be almost 3%, 2.93% this year. The United States is creating 200,000 jobs a month. The unemployment rate is now close to the 6.5% magic number. Remember, 6.5% was the number that was set by the Fed, by Bernanke, the previous chairman of the Fed, he said when 6.5% is reached, we will start increasing interest rates because the economy will now be in a good position. We have reached that level already, although the new chairman of the Fed, Janet Yellen, said that we will not start increasing rates even though we reach 6.5%, but we have reached that level. The deficit has been cut to 3.8%. The public debt is at manageable, large but manageable levels. So the United States is in good position, and it looks good going forward. It looks good because corporations have cleaned up, have repaired their balance sheets very quickly, much faster than European corporations. There is the new energy revolution in the United States, led by the oil, shale gas and oil discoveries that makes, that reduces the production costs in the United States tremendously. The labor market, as I said, continues to improve. There is a reshoring of manufacturing. After years of losing manufacturing to the developed world, now industries are going back to the United States, which would have been surprising just a couple of years ago. And as I mentioned, the threat of the fiscal disaster that was with us just a year ago is all but disappeared, at least for the next 2 years. Okay, so there's a lot of optimism in the United States, but there are some risks too. Okay, we have avoided the fiscal cliff, but the political fights continue. Right, the Obamacare program is in trouble, or it's been attacked by the Republican Party. Continue. The political fights are not over. There is a lot of fiscal uncertainties. After 2 years, right? For the next 2 years, we're not going to have fights, but what happens after the 2 years are over? Households are still highly indebted. The savings rate are really, really low in the United States. And as I said, the unemployment rate is going down, but it's going down for the wrong reasons. Okay, it is true that the U.S. is creating about 200,000 jobs a month, but the main reason why unemployment is going down is that labor force participation is falling. In other words, people are discouraged and they leave the labor force. So, it's good news that the unemployment is going down, but it's going down for the wrong reasons, and that has to change. And then finally, there is the uncertainty. Nobody really understands what's happening in the United States with inequality. Inequality has been exploding. There are, of course, political fights over why this is the case. Some people say that it's because of the Bush tax cuts that benefit the rich. Other people claim that the inequalities are the result of the new technological revolution that essentially benefits those with high human capital. Those with high levels of education are able to produce, computer applications or iPhone applications, which makes them gives them a lot of money. So the highly educated rich people get even richer. Okay, it is clear how to respond to the increasing inequality within the United States, but it is becoming increasingly a problem. It's actually becoming a problem in many developed countries, even though at the global level, inequalities are falling. Right? Inequalities are global inequality is the sum of two kinds of inequality: within country inequality. Rich Americans versus poor Americans, rich Chinese versus poor Chinese, rich Russians versus poor Russians. Those inequalities are rising, probably as a result of the technological change. But then there is the other kind of inequality, which is some countries are rich and some countries are poor, a cross-country inequality. Now, we live in a world now in which within-country inequality is increasing, but across-country inequality is actually being reduced, because over the last few decades, the growth rates of the emerging markets has been much larger than the growth rates of the rich. And this means that the cross-country differences are being reduced. So overall, global inequality, if you measure world inequality, is actually falling. But this doesn't mean that within the United States, inequalities are rising. Within Sweden, within Japan, within China, inequalities are exploding. So people are very, very worried about within-country inequalities, and that is potentially a large problem in the United States, because some politicians might be tempted to reduce these inequalities through heavily distorting taxation. Okay? Now, the big debate in the United States today is, as I was mentioning earlier, the monetary debate. The United States responded to the financial crisis with a massive increase in money supply. A few months ago, the US was printing $85 billion a month to purchase assets, $85 billion a month. And about a year ago, in May 2013, Ben Bernanke announced that these massive increases in money demand would start tapering, would start going down slowly. Listen to what I'm saying. They didn't say that money supply would go down. They said they would print at a much smaller rate. Instead of $85 billion dollars a month, they would start printing 75 billion, then 65 billion, then 55 billion, all the way down to zero. Now, when he announced that in May 2013, as you know, everybody went crazy. Capital fled away from the emerging markets. This capital flight led local governments in the emerging world to increase interest rates, which led to the collapse of investment and created, big turmoil all over the developing world. Stock markets collapsed, countries entered 3-month recessions. Just the announcement that they would reduce the rate of increase in money supply in the future. And they didn't do that at the moment. But this created a big turmoil, which should, warn us that the emerging world is very, very sensitive to what happens to the monetary policy in the United States. Now, the tapering started later in the year, later in 2013. Ben Bernanke reduced the rate of increase from 85 billion to 75. Janet Yellen continued the reduction, adding $10 billion to the reduction, and it is expected that this reduction will continue. Now, the emerging market has already priced in these reductions, but the big question is what happens after these reductions are over? Obviously, when tapering is over, the US government will have to start increasing interest rates. I do not expect interest rates to go up yet in 2014, but soon after 2014, early 2015, and certainly by mid-2015, the United States will increase interest rates. And this, of course, will create problems to everybody who has debts. Okay, the May 2013 tapering tantrum should be a warning sign that there might be problems elsewhere in the world, not in the United States, but elsewhere in the world. And we should all remember that the 1980 financial crisis was essentially a debt crisis caused by the Reagan increases in interest rates. So keep that in mind as we move forward to 2015. Okay. Let me move to the Eurozone. The Eurozone, I would say that what's happening in the United States, I mean in the Eurozone, is that the fall is over, maybe. Okay, I'm not sure. Well, I'm sure that the fall is over. Clearly, GDP is no longer GDP growth is no longer in negative territory as it was just a year ago. The growth rate is expected to be anemic, less than 1% in 2014. Unemployment is still high at 12%. So we're not going backwards, right? Europe is not going backwards, but it's not clear that it's going forward. Okay? So we were up in the cliff, we went down, now we're down. It's not clear we're going to go back up. It's not clear we're going to stay. You know, there's a lot of uncertainty. Now, there's a lot of positives for Europe. A lot of positives for Europe. The most important I already mentioned. The big tail risks did not materialize. Remember where we come from. A year ago, Europe was about to collapse. Greece was about to exit. Germany was about to pay for the debts for everybody. Right? That didn't happen. Spain and Italy did not default on their debts, which was a real risk a year ago. And it's probably going to be a risk in 2015. But that didn't happen yet. The European leaders, I think, European leaders have realized that excessive austerity is a bad idea. That wasn't true a year ago. Now the talk about, reduction of fiscal deficits in Europe, no matter what, that talk has stopped. Countries have been allowed to have larger deficits than they were allowed a year ago. And this might be one of the reasons why Europe is growing a little bit more, or will be growing a little bit more in 2014 than it grew in 2013. Some countries have experienced internal devaluations. As you know, most countries in Europe have the same currency, so they cannot devalue. So when you have a recession, you cannot get out of the recession by devaluing, making your products cheaper, which allows you to export. When you cannot do that, you have to, when you are in the middle of a recession, you have to reduce prices, you have to reduce costs, you have to reduce salaries, which is really painful. Painful for the families, painful for the politicians that do that. Now this has happened in some countries. It has happened in Spain, it has happened in Portugal, it has happened in Greece, it has not happened in France or Italy. But some internal devaluation has already occurred. Another piece of good news for Europe is that the beginning of an agreement on the banking system, the new rules for the bank, for bank liquidation, for bank rescuing, have been established. We have a new single resolution mechanism. We have a new single resolution fund of $55 billion, which will be financed by the banks. So this is good news. This is good news for countries like Spain, for example, that still are in the middle of a credit crunch. Now, the problem for these countries is that their banks, just because they are Spanish banks, and because they have to be rescued by the Spanish government, which has no money, when they borrow abroad, they are charged a premium, because they know that they're not going to be able to be rescued by the Spanish authorities since they have no money. And because there is a risk premium charge on the banks pass this higher interest to the small and medium enterprises, which means that they essentially cannot borrow. Right? The interest rates are too high. And therefore, there's no credit, and therefore, exiting the recession becomes a lot more complicated. Now, the way to solve that is to have a European rescuing system. And therefore, it is imperative for these diabolic vicious circle of inability to borrow, high interest rates, therefore more inability to borrow, and higher interest rates and more inability to borrow, and the collapse of the entire economy. It is imperative to solve that problem to have a European banking system. Now, of course, the European banking system did not exist before the recession. There is progress in that direction, actually progress over the last few weeks in that direction, even though the progress has been clearly insufficient, clearly not well funded, but in the right direction. Now, at the end of the year, we're going to have the stress tests published by the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank is now evaluating the banks all over Europe. And it will tell us, I think in November, what banks are good, what banks are bad, what banks could resist another recession, could resist government default, by doing some stress tests. Okay, I have done some stress tests of my own, and I think that the results will be very positive for most European banks. The exception are the Italian banks, and, surprise, surprise, some German banks. Okay, so we will see, I think, in November, that the stress test will be good for Spain, will be good for France, for Portugal, it will be a disaster for Italy, and for some regional government banks. We should wait and see what happens, but this is in the horizon, right? If I'm not correct, if the banks in Europe are not healthy, then there will be question marks on the European recovery. Okay. Now, another piece of good news for Europe, even though Europeans think is a bad thing, is deflation. Right? You have noticed that in Europe, people talk about prices going down. The European Central Bank in November reduced interest rates because they were feared deflation. I think the fears of deflation are overrated. There are two reasons to be fearful of deflation. One is wrong, one is right. First, people fear deflation because when prices go down, they think that consumers will postpone the purchases of goods, right? You wait for the prices to go down even further, and therefore consumption goes down. I think this fear is wrong. Right? We see in the market, there's lots of markets where prices go down continuously, yet we don't see consumption falling. We actually see consumption very, very strong. Computer markets, right? Telephone markets, cellular phones, applications, right? Prices go down in these markets continuously, yet we don't observe people continuously postponing consumption. People cannot postpone consumption forever. Sooner or later they have to buy the new refrigerator, or certainly every day they need to buy food. So a lot of the consumption cannot be postponed, and the consumption that can be postponed, durable goods, will not be postponed, because it's not postponed in the markets where it can be postponed, like telephones. Now the second fear is actually well-founded. If you are indebted, if you have debt, when prices go down, the real value of your debt increases. So for highly indebted economies, for highly indebted families, for highly indebted companies, for highly indebted countries, deflation is a bad idea because it increases the cost of paying the debt. And therefore, because the European Central Bank is fearful of this deflation, they started in November an expansion of their monetary base, an expansion of money of their own. Up until November, the European Central Bank was actually observant of what was happening in the United States, but they didn't really print money, because the European Central Bank has only one goal in the Constitution. The Constitution of the European Central Bank says that you should monitor and you are in charge of price stability only. Unlike the United States, where the government has a dual role, price stability and unemployment. So the United States can print money, the Federal Reserve can print money when unemployment is very high, because their job is to reduce unemployment also. And they have to balance between unemployment and inflation, right? The United States has only one, Europe has only one goal, inflation. Sorry, not inflation, price stability. Price stability means that you should fight inflation, but you should also fight deflation. And if the European Central Bank sees that prices are about to fall, as they are seeing now, then they start printing money like crazy. And that's what they did in November, and that's what they will continue to do in the near future. In the next meeting of the European Central Bank, interest rates will go back down 15 basis points. Okay, they went down 25 in November, they will go down again. Okay, there is talk that they might actually even have negative interest rates. They will charge banks to have deposits in the European Central Bank. So therefore, monetary policy will be more lax in Europe because of the fear of deflation, which is good because money will flow more freely, and therefore the economy will recover faster. However, despite these reasons for optimism in Europe, recovery is going to be anemic, right? Growth will not go up to 2%, growth will be less than 1%, 0.9%. Why? Because, as I was mentioning earlier, the structural reforms have not been implemented in many European countries. Europe has been the slowest, along with some emerging markets, in implementing structural reforms. The euro has been too strong, right? Despite the recession, the euro is still a very, very strong currency. This is about to end. As the European Central Bank continues to print, and as the Federal Reserve reduces the rate of increase of money supply, the euro is going to go down. The euro, we should expect the euro to be at 125 as opposed to 138 within the year. Okay. The credit crunch, as I was mentioning earlier, the credit crunch continues in many countries in the periphery. Right? In Spain, Italy, for example, there has been internal devaluations in some countries, but not in all countries. France and Italy being the exceptions. And a lot of the southern European periphery countries have huge fiscal problems. What started as private sector debt, banking sector debt, family debt, corporate debt problem has now been transformed into a public debt problem. Okay, the deficits are too large. The debt has shot through the roof, and this is a problem because many of these countries have political and social problems, social unrest, as austerity fatigue sets in. Sooner or later, Spain will have to cut the deficit. Sooner or later, Italy will have to cut the deficit. And there is a lot of social opposition to further tax increases, to further government cuts in government spending. Okay. Now, of course, within Europe, overall Europe is going to be better, but not much better. And of course, there's going to be, as it was the case for the world, decoupling within Europe, with Germany and the UK booming with strong growth, low unemployment, strong exports, big investment boom, construction booms, and so on and so forth. A lot of optimism in Germany as they see one of the consequences of not having collapsed, of not having Europe collapsed, is that the Germans all of a sudden, they feel that they're not going to have to pay the bills. Right? A year ago, they thought they were going to have to pay the bills for all Europe. All of a sudden, this is money that they think they have that they didn't have a year ago, which is good. Now, there are countries doing well. There are countries that they're not going to do poorly, Spain probably is in this middle group, and then there is going to be disasters. Italy is very close to a full-grown depression. As I said, the Italian banks will probably fail, or many Italian banks will probably fail the stress tests, as they cannot survive another recession. The GDP in Italy is still 91% of what it was in the pre-recession days. And it is unclear that Matteo Renzi will be able to implement its reforms. Okay. How am I doing on time? How am I doing? Do good? Can I talk about Japan? Let me talk about Japan just a little bit, because I want to talk about the emerging markets. But let me mention Japan, just a little bit of Japan. Japan, as you know, implemented the so-called Abenomics. Abenomics had 3 legs, right? The new policy regime that was supposed to get the economy out of a 23-year-long recession or lack of growth. Okay. Now, one of the legs was a fiscal stimulus. Second leg was monetary expansion. The goal of these two was to depreciate the yen in order to induce growth through exports. Okay. Now, this was quite successful. The yen actually weakened, the stock market boomed, corporate profits increased, private sector confidence improved, the end of deflation, which was a problem in Japan, growth rates start jump, so it worked, okay? But then there was a third leg. The third leg that was structural reforms and tax changes that would allow the finance of the first 2 legs without having to increase debt, which is already the largest in the world. Okay. Now, this third leg has not been implemented, and there is a tax increase coming up. And there's a lot of uncertainty of what's going to happen as the consumption tax increases in the next month. Okay. The reason why people worry about the tax increase is that it already happened in '97. When the recession started in 1990, after 7 years of recession, Japan started to grow in 1996, 1997. And at that moment, the government increased the consumption tax. And that led to a second recession, which lasted to this day. And therefore, Japan, because of that tax increase, has had 23 years worth of zero or negative growth. Okay? And therefore, people who have these in their memories, stuck in their brains, are fearful of what's going to happen as the third leg of Abenomics is implemented and the tax increase is, the new tax increase is implemented. So we have to keep an eye on Japan and the implementation of the third leg. Okay? Now, let me go to the emerging markets, okay? The emerging markets are not what they used to be, okay? The emerging markets are growing at 4.5%. I would expect them to grow a little bit faster, 4.8, 4.9, maybe 5% during this year. And within the emerging markets, we're going to see 2 clubs of countries, right? The decoupling that occurs within the world, within the emerging markets, will also occur within the emerging world. As Kim mentioned in the introduction, we should forget the BRICS. Right? We are in the world of falling bricks. The bricks are fallen. Some, they have fallen into deep mediocrity. Russia, South Africa, Brazil. The good days are over for these countries. Some are growing at what would be healthy rates for developed countries, but they are very unhealthy for their historical standards. India and China are expected to grow at 6%, 7% respectively this year. Okay? On the other hand, there is a bunch of well-managed, small, open economies that they did the homework over the last few years, and I expect them to do well, despite the fact that commodity prices are falling, and despite the fact that China is going down, and they depend crucially on China. Countries like that depend crucially on China include Peru and Chile. But I expect them to continue to do well. Also in Latin America, Colombia and Mexico, I expect them to do well. In Asia, I expect Korea, Malaysia, and the Philippines to do well. In Europe, the Czech Republic and Poland are expected to do well. These are economies that have managed their fiscal and monetary and financial sectors fairly well over the last few years. Now, there are countries that did not manage their economy as well. Countries that have double deficits, the twin deficit of the fiscal sector, the government sector, fiscal deficit along with foreign sector, negative net exports or current account deficit, twin deficits, countries with high inflation, countries with very slow growth, and countries which have political cycles this year. These countries that have these characteristics have been labeled as the Fragile Five. Fragile Five, or BITS, B-I-I-T-S, Brazil, India, Indonesia, Turkey, and South Africa. Now, to these Fragile Five, I would add 6 additional fragile countries to complete the Fragile 11, or Ocean's 11, or Sala-i-Martin's 11. These are Argentina, Hungary, Russia, Thailand, Ukraine, and Venezuela. Now, why are the emerging markets not doing so well? What's the problem with the emerging world? Well, I would say there are 5 reasons. 5 important reasons why the emerging world as a whole, even though there's going to be decoupling, as a whole, the emerging world is not doing so well. Remember, I said it's not doing so well. I expect them to do a little bit better. So first I'm going to explain why they're not doing so well, then I'm going to explain why I think they're going to be doing a little bit better. Why are they not doing so well? First, many of these countries crucially depend on China. On China's demand for their products, on China's demand on overall products, which increases prices of the products they sell. And of course, the Chinese slowdown hurts them. Second, the commodity supercycle is over. If you look at the terms of trade for all of these countries, they've done very, very well, right? The price of what they export relative to the price of what they import. They have been doing very well over the last 10 years. Now, if you look at the terms of trade now, it's going down. It's fallen by about 1/4 over the last 2 years. Now, this, of course, is due to the slow growth of China. China commands a big part of the demand for these commodities, but also to the reaction of the supply to high prices. When you have high oil prices, people look for alternatives. Americans invent shale oil and shale gas methodologies to produce more. And of course, this increase in supply ends up reducing the overall price. So the reaction of the supply and the slowdown of China means that the commodity supercycle is over. Prices are falling. They're not going to be as high as they used to be. And of course, those countries that depend on the exports of these products will consequently, which are mostly emerging countries, are going to suffer. Third, I already mentioned the U.S. tapering. Right? In May 2013, the US announces that it will start reducing the rate of increase. Right? They don't increase interest rate. They announce that they will start reducing the rate of increase of money supply, and this collapses the entire emerging markets. The reason is that a lot of what happened in the emerging markets was that the capital that was in the rich world left during the Great Recession to the emerging world. So for a few years, essentially the emerging markets were borrowing from or living out of the U.S. money, as U.S. and European corporations left those countries during the recession. Now, the announcement of the end of the end of monetary expansion was read as, oh, the U.S. is going well again. It's time to go back home. Capital leaves the emerging world. This, of course, creates, starts to create exchange rate depreciations. In order to fight these exchange rate depreciations, local governments increase interest rates and they create a collapse. Now, the problem is that this will continue, right? The tapering will continue. For a reason why the emerging market did not do so well in the past, the years of zero interest rate policy, quantitative easing in the developed world, the times of easy money, led many developing countries, many emerging countries, to conduct excessively expansionary policies of their own. Many of them run fiscal deficits. Many of them also had lax monetary policy. And now they have high levels of debt, twin deficits, and excessive inflation, and they have to correct for that. Okay? And fifth, and most important, the second generation reforms have not taken place. Many emerging markets did well because they learned the lessons of the 1990s. The great recessions of the 1980s and 1990s in Latin America and East Asia led them to conduct rigorous fiscal policies. They led them to have independent central banks that targeted inflation as opposed to targeting exchange rates, flexible exchange rates, accumulation of reserves, basic stuff that was needed in order to have the first round of economic growth. Now, to have the second round of economic growth, you need to go further. You need to have more private sector freedom. You need to have more liberalization. You need to have more competition. And therefore, you need to have the second generation reforms. Now, most of the developing world did not do those reforms. On the contrary, they actually adopted a more statist economic growth system, where state-owned enterprises played a more important role, where state-owned banks played more important roles. There was too much resource nationalism in countries like Argentina or Bolivia. There was a lot of trade protectionism in countries like Brazil. So little was done to liberalize the economy, second-generation reforms, and in many countries, the reforms were actually backwards. And now it's time to pay the price. Countries like Venezuela or Argentina are already starting to pay the price of moving, or Russia, of moving towards statist economy. Now, despite the fact that some things have gone wrong in the developing world, I do not think that they are about to collapse. There is a talk, actually, that some countries, like China, are about to collapse. We're going to face a big financial crisis soon. I don't think that's the case.
I don't think that's the case. Why? First of all, because unlike the periods of collapse of the 1980s and 90s, most countries now have flexible exchange rates. Right? Most of the financial collapse occur in countries that have fixed exchange rate, pegged exchange rates, crawling exchange rates. Now the majority of the emerging world now has fixed exchange rate, with exceptions that may actually lead to collapse. Exceptions are Ukraine, exceptions are Argentina, exceptions are Venezuela. Second, many developing countries have built a huge war chest of foreign reserves. Right? The balance of payments crisis occurs when you have fixed exchange rate and all of a sudden capital starts coming to the country and starts leaving the country. The way to defend the fixed exchange rate is to have foreign reserves that allow you to keep the capital in the country without having to increase interest rates. Well, most countries now have a lot more reserves than they used to have in the 80s and 90s. A lot of the debt of the governments is no longer in foreign currency. In the 1980s and in 1997 in Asia, the problem was that the majority of the debt was in dollars. No longer true. Many of these countries have much sounder banking systems. So there are good reasons to think that the emerging world is not about to suffer a collapse. Okay. Now let me discuss a little bit, just to start finishing up, the long term. How I see the long term of the emerging world. I see that in the short term they're going to be improving a little bit, and there's little risk. I would say 20% risk of a financial crisis. Now, how I see the long term? Now, in the long term, I see some negatives for the emerging world. As I mentioned, the long needed second-generation structural reforms have not been implemented, and they have been postponed over and over again. And the more you postpone, the less you're going to grow in the future. Second, saving rates continue to be too small in many countries, particularly in Latin America, in Africa, but also in places like Turkey. This means, having low savings rates means that if you want to invest, right? Remember, the current account is the difference between savings and investment. If you want to invest, if you want your country to have investment and you don't have savings, you're going to have to borrow from abroad. Capital has to come from abroad, otherwise you cannot invest, right? If the resources don't come from locals, they have to come from foreigners. And of course, if capital comes from abroad, then you are dependent on sudden stop problems, right? What happens if you depend on foreign capital and all of a sudden capital stops coming, or capital starts leaving? That's what might lead to a financial crisis. One way to solve this problem is to increase the savings rates, and many emerging countries have too low savings rates. Now, the commodity supercycle has meant that many countries depend too much on a single resource, oil, copper. Okay, a lot of these countries have been talking about diversification. Every time you go to Saudi Arabia, they talk about diversification. You go to Chile, they talk about diversification. The fact is, however, that they didn't diversify. A lot of these countries still depend crucially on their main source of export revenue, and this is problematic. The fourth problem in the long term, the fourth long-term problem for the developing world is that as they grow, we start noticing a phenomenon. When emerging countries grow, a middle class arises. And with the middle class, social and political tensions arise. We see demonstrations in Brazil, in Turkey, in Russia, in the Arab world, everywhere. Okay. Now, the reaction to these demonstrations might be dangerous. Many governments react to these public demands or social demands with populist policies. Populist policies means, policies that try to reduce inequality without thinking that there are fiscal and external constraints. If you start giving money without really knowing where it's going to come from, you're going to end up defaulting. Populist movements, state capitalism. People complain about private banks, so governments, have more incentive to do public banks. People complain about private corporations, so there's more statism. These complaints lead to resource nationalism. Why is energy so expensive in Argentina when in Bolivia it's so cheap? Let's nationalize Repsol. Right? This leads to resource nationalism. Now, a lot of these complaints are not, they're good, and they might lead to, the reaction might be good. They might lead to good reactive policies. In countries like Brazil, for example, the complaints have been about corruption. It's good that we fight corruption. It's good that governments fight poor public administration. It's good that they fight the excessive meddling of the public sector. And the fifth reason to be pessimistic about the long-term outlook of the developing world or the emerging world is that a lot of these countries have a demographic dividend. It's much younger population than Europe, the United States, or Japan, or China. But the demographic dividend, which is good, it's good to have the young population. Young people are more productive. Therefore, young countries tend to have an advantage. However, this advantage can only materialize if the labor force is sufficiently educated. And areas like Africa, the education effort is not sufficient. In areas like Latin America, the education effort is not sufficient, or it's wrong targeted. The education inequality in Latin America is enormous. You have the best universities in the world next to the worst public schools in the world, or millions of children not even school. Now, the flip side of this, by the way, occurs in countries like Korea. They have invested so much in education that now they seem to have the problem that they have too many doctors, too many PhDs, too many engineers, and too few people to do jobs where this education is not required, which leads to frustration of these highly educated people as they see that the premium for having studied does not materialize. This also creates social turmoil. So there are 5 reasons to be not too optimistic about the emerging world. However, I am optimistic about the emerging world because I think there are other reasons that more than outweigh this negative outlook. Okay, first, there is a convergence. There is a natural tendency for poor countries to grow faster than rich countries. Okay, well-managed countries naturally tend to be able to grow faster, and these will continue to do so. Second, the industrialization trends, despite the reshoring that I was mentioning earlier for the United States, it's true that some industries are going back to the United States. It is still the tendency to for the industry to move to the emerging world. There are reforms. The Korean example is a very good example for the entire world. The entire world has seen that Korea has been a great success, in large part thanks to education. And this is a mirror in which many emerging countries are looking at themselves, and these will lead to better education policies in the future. I think that the current state of the world is leading. Everybody is seeing that the second generation reforms are needed, right? The good times are over. The good times were times where you could actually do well without having to do the painful reforms, but now either you do the reforms or you're going to stagnate forever. Therefore, there's going to be large incentives to do the reforms, and these will trigger large economic growth rates for the long term in the developing world. Now, let me finish with three pointing out the outlook for three areas of the developing world. I don't have the entire day to discuss the whole world. I think the most important country, the country that everybody is looking at today, is China. So let me start with China. The growth potential of China has gone down. The days of 11, 12% growth rates are over. The new norm is 7%. Okay? China is having problems. China has, and I think Kim mentioned this in the introduction, large excess capacity. He was talking about steel. They have excess capacity of everything. They have invested too much. Their growth model relied too much on investment, which leads, not consumption, which leads to overcapacity of everything. The financial risks have risen. Local and provincial governments are in deep financial trouble. There are housing bubbles all over the country. There is the growth of the shadow banking system, which is also in trouble. Many local governments are in trouble, local and provincial governments are in trouble because they financed too many projects with political decisions as opposed to economic decisions. The market was not part of the decision, it was government decision, and most times when that happens, things end up wrongly. The housing market, which is subject to bubbles, is now softening. Right, the end of the construction boom appears to be close. China's five largest banks, which account to 50% of all the loans, more than double, 127% increase in bad loans over the last year. There was a default for the first time in March of two prominent funds of the shadow banking system. And additional defaults would have occurred had not the government intervened and rescued small rural lenders. Unproductive investments represent an increasing financial strain on the financial sector. So lots and lots of problems in China, and of course the Chinese authorities know that. In last November, as the new direction of the Communist Party took over, they created a document where they propose the reforms, the blueprint for the new rounds of reforms. Okay. Now these reforms are on paper, they're good. The first point is that they're going to fight corruption. They call it governance by law. They say that the market will play a bigger role in making economic decisions, which is good. More government, more private sector, less government decisions. Having said that, they also state that the government should be responsible for the macroeconomic regulation, market regulation, social administration, and problems, environmental problems. There is a lesser role for state-owned enterprises and state-owned banks. There is a change in mentality. Instead of, everything needs a permit philosophy, they're going to a philosophy where you can do whatever you want as long as it's not illegal. Okay, which I think represents a big change. They're thinking about liberalizing the financial sector. And most importantly, for the short term, they're thinking about shifting their growth model from investment to consumption. They need to induce the Chinese consumers to consume more. Okay? Now, as you do that, as you reduce investment, while you induce the increase in consumption, you may actually create a recession. So if they accelerate, if they do the reforms too early and too fast, the Chinese government, the Chinese growth rate might falter. There's the big danger this year that if they do that, if they reduce investment without having increased consumption, yet the economy will collapse. And there is a risk of that happening. Okay? But this needs to be done. Right? This needs to be done. As I said, there is excess capacity, too much capacity for everything. Continued investment is the wrong road to take. Now, the authorities know that there is a very delicate balance. That's why everybody is worried about China, because it is a very delicate balance on how to move to the new growth model. If they don't do it right, there's going to be a hard landing. The experience that we have with the Chinese government, however, is that so far they've been very good at this. So I think that they will postpone the reforms, which means that the growth rate will not collapse in 2014. It means it will collapse in 2016. Right? They will postpone the collapse. And the longer they postpone, the larger the probability of collapse. So we should not worry too much about the coming year, maybe next 2 years, but the more they postpone the reforms, the larger the probability of collapse. Now, I would expect the Chinese growth rate, therefore, because the authorities will not be harsh in implementing the reforms quickly, I expect the Chinese growth rate to continue to be around 7% this year and the next. Okay, less than last year's 8%, but not close to the hard landing that many analysts are calling for. Let me finish with very quickly with two other emerging market areas. The Latin American world. I think Latin America will do, with notable exceptions, Argentina and Venezuela, Latin America will do much better in the near future. Okay, the Latin American countries have survived for the first time in their own history. They have survived the world financial crisis and doing very well. Some of the reasons I already explained. They have sound banks, they had sound fiscal policy, they have independent central banks, they have the inflation targeting, they had flexible exchange rates, which they didn't have in the past. So they learned the lessons, and therefore, because these good things are policy related, I would expect that they continue to do well. Okay. Now there is another factor that helped Latin America, which was a little bit of luck, right? They did well, but they were lucky of the commodity supercycle, especially countries like Peru, Chile, or even Argentina. Now, of course, the commodity supercycle is over, and this means that some of these countries, which, again, they did not diversify, will start suffering. Countries like Chile and Peru, even though I expect them to grow really fast in the next year or so, they will, because they didn't diversify, they will start suffering. Of course, within Latin America, we will also see a decoupling. We have already seen, and we will continue to see the decoupling. On top of these countries that I mentioned, and Colombia and Mexico, that will continue to do well. Mexico's debt was upgraded over the last month twice. Now they are in the A range again for the first time since the 1980s. So they are doing well, even though Mexico did not do well in 2013. I expect them to grow at 4% or over in 2014. Now there is still, the decoupling still means that there are still countries in Latin America that will do poorly. And this, of course, means Argentina and Venezuela. Argentina and Venezuela are extreme examples of those bad reforms that were not only not done over the last few years, but they actually were reversed as excess statism prevailed. And let me finish with black swans. Remember the black swans? Black swans are phenomena that occur with a tiny probability that they might change the world. Things that nobody thinks, nobody believes they might happen until they happen. Okay, they're called black swans because until Europeans rediscovered Australia, it was believed that black swans did not exist. Swans were white by definition. Why? Because every swan we have seen in the world is white, and therefore swans are white. Okay, but as we know, the fact that empirical evidence suggests that something occurs in a certain way, and we've never seen it occur in another way, doesn't mean it cannot happen. Now, of course, when Europeans arrived in Australia, they did discover black swans. Something that for centuries was believed to be impossible turned out to exist, turned out to be possible. Now, some people believe that there are the black swans, those zero probability events, 0.00001 probability events that all of a sudden materialize that change the world. The internet was a zero, it was a black swan. The fall of the Berlin Wall was a black swan. Now, there are black swans swimming in the Black Sea. Nobody believes that there's going to be an escalation after the invasion of Crimea. People put a zero probability event on that happening, and I put a 0.00001 probability event. But we should be very, very careful, because things look very much as they looked in 1938, where people put zero probability events on the Second World War. Okay, I'm not saying this is going to happen. In fact, I'm saying it's not going to happen. But there's a tiny, tiny probability of what happened in Ukraine will escalate. And if it escalates, there's going to be black swans all over the place, okay? Again, I'm not saying it's going to happen, just keep an eye, because small probability events, sometimes they end up changing the world. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Sala-i-Martin. Are there any questions for Mr. Sala-i-Martin? Trey? Microphone is coming. Yes, microphone. Microphone is there.
Is this working? Okay. I've got a couple comments first, and then I'd like to have your response to something. I thought it was a very good summary of current situation. Somewhat 99% of economists would probably said most of the same things. How is papering over the problems in the United States and the UK, basically doubling the derivatives markets, papering over any losses, how has that made the situation better? I mean, are you looking at things as far as the market today, or are we looking on a longer-term view? Okay, that's question number one. Because you started off saying how great, you know, the USA economy and the UK are doing because of the wealth effect, I assume, that house prices are good. Now, Columbia University is probably very important. How come economists never talk about the Depression of 1920 and 21? And they tend to look at the Great Depression, but everybody glosses over that, where it was more of an Adam Smith, more of a free hand market, where in 6 months everything was back to normal because we allowed a collapse to occur. That was my second question. And I did notice that your main comments, as far as not being a summary, but your opinion, 2 or 3 times you mentioned the commodity super cycle being over. And I'd like you to elaborate on that, if possible. And last but not least, I would like to ask you, of everything going on in the world, because you took a large, very macro view, was there any reason you avoided speaking about the US dollar as the reserve currency of the world and the ramifications and everything that's happening, if it has anything to do with that? Thank you. I very much enjoyed your speech, by the way, as annoying as I might sound.
I'm not sure I understand the last question, but...
The last question...
Let me start with why do I think tapering, I mean, why do I think that increasing monetary supply during bad times is a good idea, right? I think, I mean, monetary policy is like money is like toothpaste. Okay, it's very easy to get it out of the tube, but it's very hard to bring it back. Okay, I think money, because it's easy to get out. I think it's a good idea that during bad times, money is expansionary, mainly because of the evidence of precisely what you mentioned. The Great Depression of the 1930s, because we were in the gold standard, during the bad times, the authorities could not really print any money. And I think that what this means, or this meant, was that the recession was actually much larger than it would have been otherwise. Okay. Now we also have tons of evidence from recessions, financial crisis after the Great Depression. Right. Look at the collapse of most developing countries after that. in the 1980s during the debt crisis, in 1997 for East Asian economies, in 1994 in Mexico, in 2000, 2001 Argentina, all of them had fixed exchange rates. Fixed exchange rate essentially means you cannot control your money supply. So when there is capital flight or there is some kind of financial trouble, you know, the depression is almost automatic. Okay. Now there's a big debate in in macroeconomic circles, in academic circles. Now there are two schools of thought. There are people that say that money is neutral. Money really did not. You should not really print more money. If you print more money, what happens is that you create inflation. What happens is that you, reduce the value of the currency, and therefore these people tend to call for gold standards and or Bitcoin standards now. I think the evidence. Look at the evidence of all the financial crisis. The evidence suggests that the other view is more correct. If you do not have the flexibility during recessions, the recessions are worse. Of course, there is a downside to that, right? If you have flexibility, then people tend to print too much money, and they print too much money, then you tend to have inflation, and I think that's where you're going. Right?
Oh, but even Keynes said, yeah, okay, when you have a recession, print money, liquidity, we need it, right? Get everything going again. That's fine, but when times are good, you gotta pull it back.
Right.
We never pull it back.
Well, that's what I meant. The pull it back means you have to put it back in the toothpaste tube.
Do you know anything about the Depression of 1920-21?
No.
USA?
No. But the point, taking the money back, taking the money back is problematic because. Taking the money back is problematic because if you take too much money too early, right, you may actually hurt the economy. Like taking the money too early means raising interest rates. Raising interest rates means hurting investment, hurting consumption, durable goods, and so on and so forth. So taking money too early is bad for the economy, but taking the money too late may actually create, what you have in mind, which is bubbles and inflation and those kinds of problems. That's why I say it is hard. It is hard. Now, I'm worried about the United States now because the Janet Yellen's administration, or Janet Yellen's, Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke had a clear rule known as the Evans rule, which was, Evans is the chairman of the Chicago Fed. Once we reach 6.5%, we're going to start increasing interest rates. That was a clear rule. Now, in the last meeting, last week or 2 weeks ago, Janet Yellen changed the rule to some fuzzy rules. She said that now we have to consider many other factors, which I think means that it is not clear when we're going to start increasing interest rates. And I think that's a bad idea. I think we should have, and maybe this is where you're going, we should have a clear rule saying when we should start pulling.
I think it's clear that monetary policy has had no effect on employment. Okay, and if possibly negative effect.
I don't agree. See, one problem, what has happened during the last crisis in the United States, I don't have the graph here, is that as the money supply increased, velocity increased almost in the same proportion. So as you know, what matters, is M times V, right? Money times velocity. In other words, when the Fed printed money, initially what happened is that all corporations took the money and stored it. So the money was not circulating. The velocity, money was not moving. And exactly, so given the collapse of velocity, had not they printed money, there would have been a big collapse in GDP. Well, that's the assumption based on the past experience of countries with fixed exchange rates. As I was saying earlier, if you don't have money to print because you have fixed exchange rates, since fixed exchange means you cannot print money, you know, that's why Thailand or Korea or Indonesia collapsed in '97. That's why Mexico collapsed in '94, because they didn't have this tool. When velocity, when everybody hoards money, everybody tries to get money, there is a competition to get money, money disappears from the economy collapses. So the monetary supply times velocity didn't really change in the United States. Again, if velocity had collapsed without increasing money supply, there would have been a collapse. Now, the second question is commodity super cycle. Why do I say it's over? Well, because if you look at the terms of trade for most emerging countries, terms of trade means the price of the goods that you export relative to the price that you import. If you look at the graph, there's been an increase, continuous increase. There was a collapse in 2009, then a recuperation in 2010, continued increase 2011, and then there's been a huge decline between 2011 and today. I'm trying the price of exports relative to the price of imports. Price. Therefore, the countries that rely on exports of commodities, since Chile, since the price of copper has gone down 20% over the last 2 years, for the same amount of copper you sell, all of a sudden you have much less GDP. Automatic. If the oil prices go down by 20%, Saudi Arabian GDP goes down 20%. So countries that depend heavily on natural resources depend heavily on the prices. Now, as I said, the natural resource prices have been falling, and there are reasons to believe that these will continue. The reason why they have fallen, I think, is twofold. One, a slowdown in the rate of demand, China mainly, but second, a reaction of supply. After many years of high prices, people find alternatives, right? The shale revolution in the United States is an example. The shale revolution would not exist in the United States had prices been as low as in 1972. It's a reaction of companies that do research and development and come up with alternatives when the environment is adverse. And these two things are here to stay. The increase in supply and the reduction in demand are here to stay. That's why I say the commodity super cycle is over. The rate of increase of prices that we observed in the last decade is not going to continue to happen.
Thank you. Yes, now it's working. Sorry. Thanks very much. Any other questions? Actually, we have, in typical IREPAS fashion, our schedule has been pushed back a little bit, but I think it was really worth it. So one more question over there. Can we have the microphone?
Hello, I'm Robert Figg from the London Metal Exchange. You mentioned resource nationalism, and one of the major issues that has arisen in the steel industry in the last few weeks has been the ban on nickel exports from Indonesia, along with tin concentrates as well. And that will have an effect on stainless steel production globally. One of the things that has occurred, one of the reasons why this occurred was that Indonesia felt that they were not earning sufficient income from the export of concentrates. And so they want to see beneficiation take place and upstream industries develop up and downstream industries develop in those countries. Some have been more successful than others. Botswana has been extremely successful in introducing an upstream industry around the diamond mines. And so could you just comment a bit more about why you think that resource nationalism is not beneficial to these countries, and why they are a backward step?
Well, I think when I say resource nationalism, I was thinking of the episodes in Argentina or Bolivia where populist movements essentially expropriate companies, foreign companies. And the reason why this, I think, is a bad idea is that experience of the past, because it's not the first time that these countries have expropriated oil companies or gas companies or companies of other sorts, is that they've been very bad at managing those companies themselves. To the point that a few years later they privatize again those companies. Some foreign company buys them again until they expropriate them a few years later. Resource nationalism that leads to the state managing companies is a bad idea, essentially because governments are not very good at managing companies.
Thanks a lot. Any other questions? Apparently not. So once again, thank you very much, Mr. Sala-i-Martin. As I said, our schedule has been pushed back a little bit, but it was really worth it. Once again, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
If you don't mind, let us have a break of 20 minutes, and then let's get together for the second session. Thank you.
Thank you.